The transatlantic slave trade, spanning from the 16th to the 19th centuries, remains one of the most egregious and defining epochs in human history. This vast enterprise of human trafficking not only facilitated the forced migration of millions of Africans, but also reshaped continents, economies, and societies on an unprecedented scale. Its legacy continues to impact the descendants of those who were enslaved, as well as the global socio-economic and cultural landscapes. The roots of the transatlantic slave trade are deeply intertwined with the age of exploration and European colonial expansion. As European nations, particularly Spain and Portugal, ventured into Africa and the Americas, they encountered indigenous populations and rich natural resources. The burgeoning demand for labor to exploit these resources catalyzed the inception of the slave trade. Initially, European colonizers attempted to enslave indigenous peoples of the Americas. However, due to resistance, high mortality rates from diseases, and familiarity with the terrain which facilitated escape, the colonizers turned their eyes toward Africa. African societies had existing systems of slavery, primarily characterized by captives taken in wars or raids. But these systems were not based on race and allowed for greater social mobility. Europeans, leveraging existing trade networks, began to export this institution, but on a far more brutal and dehumanizing scale. The transatlantic slave trade operated through a complex network involving European, African, and American participants. European traders established forts and trading posts along the West African coast, where they exchanged goods such as guns, alcohol, and textiles for enslaved Africans. These individuals were often captured during conflicts or raids orchestrated by rival African groups, or were sold by their own leaders in exchange for European goods. Once acquired, the enslaved were subjected to the harrowing Middle Passage, a transoceanic voyage that stands as one of history's most brutal chapters. Ships designed for maximum capacity, often at the expense of basic human dignity, transported hundreds of captives in horrific conditions. Enslaved Africans were shackled, given minimal sustenance, and subjected to disease, abuse, and psychological torment. Mortality rates were staggeringly high, with estimates suggesting that up to 20% of the captives perished during the journey. Upon arrival in the Americas, those who survived were sold at auctions and forced to work primarily on plantations. The labor was intensive and grueling, focusing on the cultivation of cash crops such as sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee. The economic profitability of these plantations hinged on the exploitation of enslaved labor, embedding slavery deeply within the economic fabric of the colonial and later national economies. The impact of the transatlantic slave trade on Africa was profound and multifaceted. It decimated populations, particularly in West and Central Africa, as millions of individuals were forcibly removed. This loss of human capital destabilized societies, disrupted local economies, and exacerbated intergroup conflicts. The social fabric was torn apart as families and communities were disbanded, leading to long-lasting demographic imbalances. The trade also distorted traditional power structures, with certain African leaders and states becoming complicit in the trade in exchange for European goods and firearms. This increased militarization and political fragmentation, hindering long-term development and fostering environments conducive to further exploitation and conflict. In the Americas, the influx of African labor transformed the socio-economic landscape. In the Caribbean and South America, particularly in Brazil, the scale of plantation economies was immense, necessitating a continuous supply of enslaved labor. These regions witnessed the highest numbers of African arrivals, fundamentally shaping their demographic and cultural identities. In North America, particularly in the southern colonies and later states, slavery became institutionalized, forming the backbone of the agrarian economy. The legacy of this system would persist, leading to profound racial divisions and conflicts, most notably culminating in the Civil War and the ongoing struggles for civil rights. While Europe did not experience the direct impact of slavery on its soil to the same extent, the economic benefits reaped from the trade were substantial. The profits from slavery and the products of enslaved labor fueled the growth of European economies, financing industrialization and contributing to the rise of global capitalism. Cities such as Liverpool, Bristol, and Nantes flourished as key nodes in the trade network, with their wealth and infrastructure often built upon the proceeds of human suffering. The movement to abolish the transatlantic slave trade gained momentum in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, driven by moral, economic, and political factors. Enlightenment ideals of liberty and equality, along with the tireless efforts of abolitionists, gradually swayed public opinion and policy. Key figures such as Olaudah Equiano, William Wilberforce, and Frederick Douglass highlighted the inhumanity of the trade, while slave rebellions and resistance further underscored the untenability of the system. Britain officially ended its participation in the trade in 1807, followed by the United States in 1808. However, illegal trading persisted for decades. Full abolition of slavery in British territories came in 1833 and in the United States in 1865, following the Civil War. The legacy of the transatlantic slave trade is enduring and pervasive. The descendants of enslaved Africans, particularly in the Americas, continue to grapple with the socioeconomic and psychological scars left by slavery. Issues such as systemic racism, economic disparity, and cultural dislocation can trace their roots to the era of enslavement. In Africa, the trade's legacy is seen in the lingering effects of depopulation, economic disruption, and political instability. The historical trauma of the slave trade is a central theme in the diaspora's cultural memory, influencing art, literature, and identity.